Hello, guardians of the blind and travelers in time. Welcome. Come with me and let's weave a tale of myth and magic. I am but a bard, like so many of you, and this is the first ever episode of Podcast from the Twilight World. The first podcast solely dedicated to Blind Guardian, God's gift to music. Before we get started, I just want to throw a huge shout out to the Bards Tavern and Blind Guardian memes, two awesome pages on Facebook, and if you haven't checked them out already and you love Blind Guardian as much as I do, you're going to want to swing by and check them out. And while you're on Facebook, swing by our community and join up. We'd love to hear stories from you. If you met the band, how you learned about them, like your collections, all that sort of thing. The whole point of this podcast, aside from scratching an itch for me to talk Blind Guardian, was to provide a place where you guys could have a voice. I'd love to get a few of you guys on the podcast. I wanted to get a few of you from different parts of the world. We can talk Blind Guardian. Now I've got the first few plans out, but after that I'd love to get a few of you guys on the show and we can start talking about it. While I'm giving shout outs, I'd love to give a huge thanks to my man Chuck over at Podcast and Stone. If you guys are excited about the new Demons and Wizards stuff upcoming, or you want to hear more of Iced Earth because you had heard it from D&W, or you just want to listen to the band, or you just want to hear a good podcast, swing on over there. They got a great show. I've been thinking about doing this, whether it was a channel or a podcast, for since I guess it'd be 2015. It'll make more sense in the video as you go forward here. But I didn't really, being a fan, I didn't really think that I really could. I mean, I'm not, as you can see, I'm not a genius. Disclaimer here, guys. I'm not a genius editor. I'm not a seasoned podcaster. I'm not. I'm just a regular guy. And when I saw their podcast, I realized that regular guys can do that too. Their love was Iced Earth. My passion's for Blind Guardian. I wanted to start something like that. So I reached out to Chuck, and he was kind enough to share my page with all you guys. So thanks again, Chuck. That being said, disclaimer again. As I said, I'm not an editor. I'm not a historian. I'm just a fan. I love the band. So I hope you guys enjoy the videos, but forgive me if it comes across as a bit amateur. But with the end of June on the horizon and Legacy of the Darklands on its zenith, I figured what better time than now to talk about this wonderful album. Now, I know I have to mention the Orchestral album. A lot of you veteran Guardians are going to be chuckling to yourselves, and rightfully so. But as for you younger ones, I think it's really important that you understand the significance of this album and what it means to us, the reason it's been driving us. It's not just another album by the greatest band that ever wrote music. It's so much more than that, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll understand that. In order to talk about that, I have to weave another tale. So come back with me, if you will. The year is 1994, and Blind Guardian is fresh off Imaginations from the Other Side, an album that during its recording was known for the lavish drink and song. They often invited friends to the recording space while they were writing music. It came very naturally to them. It was at this time that Andre had first started toying with the idea of adding symphonics. He had a Pro Logic and a small synthesizer, and what he would do is he would write simple melodies, knowing where they needed to go, with bad samples, and send it to Matthias, who in turn would work with him on it and develop into something more grand. Now, the recording of Nightfall was not the same as Imaginations from the Other Side. Their shelter that they had used for recording previously was now closed down. They had to find a new place, and what they ended up settling on, for part of it anyways, another video, what they ended up settling on was 2 rooms in terrible disrepair. this was the birth of the Twilight Hall, the studio. It was wet. It was by all means bleak and not at all what they were used to. It was cramped, and it was all they had. At this time too, Andre was feeling the stress of this album, as well as many of the other bands. Imaginations is a great album, and many of them had considered it a pinnacle of their career at the time. And they weren't sure if they could top it. But as Andre said, they wrote one song and they wrote two, and pretty soon they had three, and then they knew they could do it. Which, thank goodness they had pressed on, because we got Nightfall, Middle Earth, which, by my account, the finest Blind Guardian album ever to happen. But that's a story for another time. So Hansi told the website Exclaim in an interview, "We started working on it 20 years ago when we did the songwriting for Nightfall and Middle Earth. There were some songs that just contained orchestral portions and my singing, and we decided it doesn't make sense to have them on the Nightfall album. So we took these songs and put them aside, and ever since we've been working on orchestral arrangements whenever there was a need." Now, after Blind Guardian did Nightfall and Middle Earth, the next album was A Night at the Opera, which by far was one of their most complex, and that's saying a lot. If you listen to Imaginations on the other from the other side and Nightfall and Middle Earth, you can hear the complexity in the music, and obviously from what we've known of the orchestral going forward and the tracks that didn't quite fit with Nightfall, you can really tell. Now, Night at the Opera has some really heavy tracks. Like, you listen to the first song, Precious Jerusalem, and you can really feel that, a heavy sort of aggression to the music. But that doesn't mean that it didn't tie into the orchestral album. When you listen to And Then There Was Silence, the epic off the album, the last track, it's 14 minutes long, and you can hear them really toying with the idea and concepts of doing a more classical approach to their music. I think this is really where it inspired, because after that we started hearing from them that they'd been, working on it. It is when it all first started. I mean, they'd been working on stuff since Nightfall, but really musically they were telling us, and then there was silence. You can hear the influence of the orchestra, and obviously so. Now that being said, there was silence for a long time. There's been rumors floating around, traded in back alleys, from other bards. And I'm sure that I've read somewhere Hansi and Blind Guardian were actually selling some of their music to Peter Jackson. Originally, Peter Jackson was supposed to be using some of those orchestral parts in Lord of the Rings. Now, we don't really know what happened, and why that didn't come to fruition, but for whatever reason, I'm kind of happy that it didn't, because again, this legacy that we've been building towards, this legacy that we're only to the point of the year 2000, but what we're looking at is going forward. I mean, 2000, it's been 19 years since then. So with that being said, there was silence until after that, until about 2006, I'd say, unless you include the cues from Night at the Opera, which was actually 2002, not 2000. But the point is that it had, like, even between 2006 and 2002, 98, 2000, all those years when when you think about that could have been released at that time, or they were working on that at that time. Like, that's when the seeds of this all started. I'm sure even you younger listeners, or not younger listeners, but you listeners that are rather new to Blind Guardian can appreciate how important that album is, given that. But in 2006 would have been the first time I had actually heard it mentioned. Mind you, I didn't hear it. My buddy Brian actually gave me the CD a number of years later, because Twisted Myth is one of the ones I got later on in life. But on that CD, when we were listening to it, there was an interview where Hansi and I think I should know it. Sorry, it's Andre who mentions the orchestral project, which I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but I think he says something to the effect that he thinks that it'll really surprise fans, the direction that they're going in, and that's the real first, like, announcement thing. It wasn't announced. They said that it was coming soon. So 2010 rolls around, and no orchestral album. It had been 4 years since A Twist in Myth had been released, and At the Edge of Time was released instead. Now, for me, I love that album. It holds a special place in my heart because that was my first new release as a Blind Guardian fan. I'd been a fan for only about a year or two, so I wasn't used to this whole, it takes 4 years. It had been, 2 years, and I'm like, oh, where's the new album? They're taking so long. Not even realizing that, A Night at the Opera and A Twist in Myth had been 4 years, and that continuing forward, it was going to be 4 or 5 years in between albums. But I think a lot of people were unfortunately disappointed because they thought it was going to be the orchestral album. Now, that album in its own right is awesome. And I think that, like we were talking about previous, and then there was silence musically saying to us that we're perfecting our work with the orchestra, we're perfecting how we play with them, and to some extent, that's a masterpiece. So I don't want to take anything away from that. To some extent, I believe that if they had released the orchestral album at that time, it still would have been amazing. It's Blind Guardian; it could not be, but it's important to note, too, that Blind Guardian doesn't half-ass anything. They don't release anything till it's met their perfection, right? So I think that they wouldn't have released it at that point, and obviously they didn't. And again, I'm not taking anything away from that. I just feel like, that song and that album, they're saying to us, we're working on it so that it'll be even that much better on the orchestra. And if that's what that's saying in, and then there was silence, certainly Sacred Worlds and a bunch of tracks off of At the Edge of Time, certainly Sacred Worlds is saying to us that we perfected it. They gave us something that we could really appreciate and realize that this album is going to be earth-shattering. It's going to be completely different, but it's going to be amazing. And I think that's the important thing to take out of this, is that they're taking a long time for it, and pre-orders are in June. We're to the end of June already. But even so, the album itself is going to be awesome because they're taking that much longer. Now, Sacred Worlds, if I remember right, was released in a video game. It was a sequel to something. It was a pretty good game. I can't remember what it was, but you could actually watch them perform, Blind Guardian as computer generated characters in it. Now, of course, Marcus and Andre being huge computer fans, computer game fans, the Bard's Tale famously inspiring, the Bard songs. But I'm getting off topic here. What I do want to say about it is that although musically they were telling us, this is what we've been striving towards. In text, there was very little mentioned at that time. There had been a mention in between then and 2015 about the Misty Mountains, a song that they had written for the orchestral album that was going to be included on it. But that was about it. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff, unless you guys might have a magazine or you might have an article somewhere. And if you do, please share it below. I'd love to read about it. But there really wasn't too much being said about the album. Now, 2015, was the release of Beyond the Red Mirror. So that was the main focus. And if you listen to that album in particular, if the other two leading up to it had said, we're working towards it, we perfected it, you hear the choral suites in the ninth wave, or those like violins aggressively chiming in, and you can really tell that this album is going to be earth-shattering. If you had any doubt previous, and even if you don't like the album, the arrangements on it are amazing. So if you aren't a huge fan of Beyond the Red Mirror, I encourage you to take another look at it. And At the Edge of Time, if you don't like that one as well. But I encourage you to take another look at it because there is so much going on musically. And I think it's a really great blueprint to what we can expect from the orchestral album in a lot of different ways. Now, like I said, we hadn't heard anything until 2015, really. Hansi had mentioned in an interview, they had talked about somehow Deep Purple had gotten brought up, which was an influence for Hansi. And of course, they did that famous album where they recorded with the orchestra, which was something that hadn't really been done at all at that time. And you can kind of see a parallel between that and maybe some influence on, why they wanted to go this direction, which I'm happy they are, because I think their work with classical music, so far, their track record is amazing. I think that they're going to do awesome. But that being said, it was mentioned that Hansi had already 7 songs recorded vocally, and there was just about 3 more. They were working with some, with an orchestra in Prague, and they were just working to make sure that it was all, perfect. And I think even at that point, they had mentioned that they were hoping for a release in 2016, but realistically, it was going to be 2017. Which again, this is where those of you that aren't maybe as familiar with this album can understand why the memes have been made, why the jokes have been made, because there had been mention of leading up. Now, I mean, rightfully so that everyone, that there is room to point to that it has been delayed a little bit. But again, if the indication of everything Blind Guardian's done up till now points to anything, it's that that the more time they take with something, the better it is. And I mean, like, that's not to take anything away. I mean, the albums that came in, even the early albums, like, I mean, it doesn't matter how long was between them. They were all amazing albums. There's no question about that. But I think it's a good sign that that going forward they are taking this long, because they're making sure it's perfect, guys. So hang in there. I think the next Yeah, I think it. Yeah, the next bit of information would have been in 2016. I think it was, where they told. I think it was the Metal Voice. That they had planned for a regular Blind Guardian album in 2020, and the plan was for the Orchestral album to be released in 2017, 2018. And again, that obviously didn't happen, but for good reason, no doubt. Hansi had mentioned, the interesting thing was, at this point, Hansi had mentioned that the album's concept was actually based around the ancient Czech Republic. So for those of you that have been following the story, and likely if you've been watching this video, there's a good chance you've been following up till now with the stuff surrounding Legacy of the Darklands. You know that there's a book that was released in German in March, and we'll get to that as well. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Now, after 2016, we really didn't hear anything from the Blind Guardian camp regarding the Orchestral album. They maintained pretty silent about its recording and about its release date. 2017 came and went, and I think that's when a lot of fans really got concerned that it wasn't going to happen. I'd heard rumors of it being canceled. I heard people mention that they thought it had been lost due to system crashing, which I think derives from a running joke between Hansi and Andre, where they had joked about during the Night at the Opera recordings and the early days of Pro Logic, every time Hansi would come in the room, the running joke was that the system would crash. And because of that, some of the early stuff on that album was lost because of it. But I don't think that that's actually what had happened in the past. I think they've been taking their time. But again, that's just personal speculation. It'd be up to the Blind Guardian guys to really tell you. But that being said, I think this is really when the memes started coming full swing, joking about, finding the Ark of the Covenant before you'd hear the Orchestral album, dying of old age, passing it on to your children, that sort of thing. And rightfully so. I mean, it had been a year, and 2017, like I said, came and went with no Orchestral album. People became very concerned about it. But in 2018, last year, in September, Hansi took to the official forums and made an announcement saying that they had to wait a little longer. He made the joke as well about having talked about it in the past and saying he'd burned his fingers on the Orchestral project a couple times, to say it nicely, which is, kind of where the jokes had started. But he had mentioned that they had recorded 10 out of 11 songs, and they'd each had a good amount of versions of it. They were in the pre-selecting phase at that point. They did mention as well, what really sparked curiosity with fans was the mention of a rework of an old song for the Orchestral album, titled Guardian of the Netherworld. And that sparked a lot of curiosity amongst fans as to which, and speculation as to which song this would be. Now, the user Pride Rock was the first one to comment on this, saying that he was hyped about Guardians of the Netherworld, and made a few speculations. He asked, more importantly, about the song we'd mentioned previous, the Misty Mountains, which, if you remember correctly, was mentioned in the in-between phases, in the silence before we really had interviews of confirmed stuff. Hansi had mentioned it in passing. But Hansi says that Misty Mountains was just a working title. The song that he was referring to that would be reworked was actually Guardians of the Netherworld. Well, if he sticks to that. He mentions, that because everything's been put in digital form, really there's, even just a slight mention of a date, even if it wasn't necessarily confirmed, turns into something much more. He mentions that some of your guesses were correct. And prior to that, in that previous post, Pride Rock had mentioned that Guardians of the Netherworld he had hoped would be something from Nightfall in Middle Earth, Night at the Opera, From Beyond the Red Mirror. Those three were mentioned. Anything sounding dark and epic. Now, that was really the only guesses that were ventured. We did hear from a couple other people as well, but there was no mention of specific tracks. So what's interesting about it is, at that point, Hansi mentions that some of the guesses were correct. So we know from Pride Rock's comment that it has to be something off Nightfall in Middle Earth or Night at the Opera or Beyond the Red Mirror. Now, afterwards, there was silence again for a little bit as the forums kind of bustled with different ideas of what it could be. But the general consensus being more thinking it would be Thorn. There was mentions of Time Stand Still or The Noldir as well, or Last Candle, that sort of thing. But since Hansi had confirmed those other three albums previous, it's unlikely. That being said, he would go on later to discredit a couple of those choices. But on the 30th, he confirmed that it's not a song from Nightfall, and it's not Silence either. So we know that it's not from A Night at the Opera, at least it's not, and then there was Silence, and we know that it's nothing off of Nightfall in Middle Earth. So that gets rid of Time Stands Still, The Noldor, and Blood Tears, which really leaves just a few options. But Thorn has been discredited due to the fact that Nightfall has been revoked. And since there was no, and then there was Silence either, that means that it has to be something else from either Night at the Opera or something from Beyond the Red Mirror, which, if you listen to that album, and I'd mentioned before, there's a lot of Orchestral tracks, so it could be something off there as well, but it would be really cool to hear something from A Night at the Opera in an orchestral arrangement. Hansi had maintained silence after that, so lots of it going forward was speculation. Mainly Pride Rock, who makes some interesting choices, pointing out that he thinks that some of the choices could be Blood, Tears, Nolder, Time Stand Still, or Thorn, all from Nightfall and Middle Earth. But Hansi debunked that afterwards, saying that it's nothing off of Nightfall, and it's not, and then there was Silence. So that being said, I think it's really interesting because it could be something off of Beyond the Red Mirror, like we talked about. That one being really focused on its choral suite, so it makes sense. But of course, Night of the Opera is where that excitement to start a classical project really started for Blind Guardian. So it would make sense. Or I guess more that it came to fruition. So it would make sense that it would be something off that album as well, which personally I'd love to hear something from that. The user Warmoth points out that it might not be an iconic song, which I think is really valid. He points out that maybe since they've done the reissues and A Traveler's Guide to Space and Time, they might know some potential in an older song, which I think is a cool idea. A lot of people were mentioning in the forums before and after that it might be The Last Candle, which would really be a cool one to check out. However, I think that it's something probably from Night at the Opera myself. or Beyond the Red Mirror, because judging from Hansi's comment, it kind of implies that one of the previous things had been right. He does mention Twist and Myth as well, which I could totally see with On the Edge, on that. There's definitely some strings in On the Edge and Fly in particular come to mind. So you could definitely see where that parallel might come into realization on the Orchestral album. But judging by Hansi's comment, I'm thinking it's something off of either Beyond the Red Mirror or A Night at the Opera. But I do think it would be cool if it was one of the older songs. It was the user Traveler in Time who made another good point. He said that Hansi once said and quoted an interview in German saying that he had once listened to Somewhere Far Beyond and thought, damn, with the right sound, that could be awesome. And I think that's a great idea because it would be cool to hear a different arrangement of some of those ones too, because obviously Blind Guardian doing what they want. Of course, that album being untouchable for a lot of fans, it is a really great album too. You can't complain. And I know I say that a lot, guys. Forgive me. I'm a fan. But it's a good point as well, though, that's something we could consider as well, because chances are, just because it was said that it was one of the songs off one of those albums, or it was implied that those guesses had mostly been right, there was no real for sure confirmation from Hansi as to which one it could be. So very easily could be one of the older ones, and they're throwing a red herring at us. So Pride Rock then mentions a few good guesses, which I think are pretty valid as well. He mentions Somewhere Far Beyond, it could be Theater of Pain. So that'd be an interesting one to think that it all started from back that far. I think that he had mentioned again Night at the Opera, and he suggests Battlefield, Under Ice, Punishment Divine, which are all solid choices for it. I'd love to see something done with it, but I think that when you listen to a lot of those songs on that album, you could easily pick one of them. In A Twist and Myth, he mentions Otherland, which could really be a great choice as well. Although there's quite a few options on that one, but again, since he kind of but didn't confirm that it was one of those songs, I don't feel like it could be something off of that album or At the Edge of Time. I mean, you can make an argument for Sacred Worlds being a part of it originally. You can make an argument for Road of No Release, that sort of thing. But I really think that it's got to be something off of Night at the Opera, which, is just a personal thought. The user Aharo makes an excellent point too on the fourth. He talks about what he thought. He says he doesn't think that they'd pick something from Beyond the Red Mirror or At the Edge of Time because they're too new. And I think that's a good point too. I mean, you could certainly hear where they could easily get some ideas for an orchestral album from Beyond the Red Mirror, but it is, their newest release as well. Does it make sense for them to re-release a song? He did point out that he wondered if it's part of the concept album or if it would be included as a bonus at the end of it. At which point, you can kind of wonder if they're reworking the lyrics as well. At which point you could easily say, well, I mean, it could be something from any of the albums, then it doesn't have to be. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see how that one all pans out. Now, on December 3rd, at that point, Hansi does post on the saying that most of the guesses are wrong, teasing us a little bit. And right at the same moment. So it makes you kind of wonder if they're going to combine some stuff. So it'll be interesting to hear where they go for that. He does mention of a release in summer of 2019. Again, we know now that it's that was the pre-order, would be in June. He said it all depend a bit on the record company, so it was really their fault. What's interesting too is at this point he said we have not decided how to name the baby yet. He points out that he's finished singing all the songs now, but they have 7 days of backing vocals and choir company for 3 more. And he says big classical choirs have already been done, no doubt pointing towards the work done with Beyond the Red Mirror. The choirs are done separately from the orchestra, and he points out that they go back to Prague in 2019 in the beginning of it for the last pieces of music. But they don't plan on releasing any of the alternate versions that were mentioned before, due to the fact that they would be too similar, in his opinion. He points out that Guardian of the Netherworld has changed again. He calls it Harvester of Souls now. He says that every song which is being released on the album is an old song for us, pointing out that it's been years and years. So again, this points back to what we've been saying through this video, that, you know, this has all been a process, building up and fine-tuning everything. None of these songs would have been Mordred songs or Bright Eyes. So that's kind of a shame, unfortunately. You know, I'd really wanted to believe the user that it could have been that, given the ties to the early formations. It would have made an interesting story. So originally, when they started working on a particular song as a classical version, the one that will be a Harvester of Souls, Andre had a dream, dreamt the song in a metal version, so he started working on the metal version. But he believed that classical version contains a few extra parts which are not metal at all. All the lyrics are new apart from one prominent line in the song. We still work with a storyboard he mentioned by Marcus, who's the author of the books. He did an amazing job. And Hansi's last post is on the 4th. He says, "Stay faithful, you non-believers. We are living in the digital work, so mixing is a constant process already. If things work as planned, and they usually never do in our case, so they give us fair warning, we should have the final adjustments from mid-January to mid-February. So you are right here. The mixing will have taken 6 months at least. Our mixing in preparations is big, yes. At the Edge of Time is a very good example. But so is the intro and outros to Sacred Worlds, which we touched on earlier." So earlier I mentioned that Hansi had announced that the album was going to be based around the ancient Czech Republic. And in 2011, the band had confirmed that they would be working with Marcus Heinz, a famous German fantasy author, in order to come up with a concept of the album. Now, if you had any doubt of Marcus working with Blind Guardian, let me put that to rest. Marcus' first book won the German Fantasy Award. It's called Under the Shadow of Uldart. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. But he was also nominated for a David Gemmell Award. And that was for his most famous series, which is a 5-book series known as The Dwarf. The story is about a German blacksmith named Tugdil who lives amongst humans. And he's thrust into a world of war when he reunites with his people. I haven't read it myself personally, but I mean, if it doesn't scream Blind Guardian, I don't know what does. Short of Tolkien or Robert Jordan, I really can't think of anybody who could work with them as well. Aside from, you know, maybe using black magic, I don't think that's in the cards. But that being said, at this point in the video, I'd like to delve into the annals of history. So, if that's not your thing, I've thrown a link in the description below. You can go ahead and breeze right past this. But for those of you that want to hear about it, I just want to use it for a little bit of a backdrop to our album. Lots of it will deal with stuff that happened leading up to the 30-Year War, which the synopsis takes place in. So, like I said, if you want to skip past that, just go ahead and click in the link below. If I'm able to figure out how to add that into the video so you can just click somewhere on here, I'll definitely do that for you. So for those of you that stuck around for the history portion of the video, thank you first of all. The reason this part's in the video at all is because I wanted to explain the lead up to the 30-Year War, which raged in Europe. Now, I didn't know anything about it. The only reason I researched it at all was because it's mentioned in the synopsis. and it itself would probably make an awesome Blind Guardian concept album. So I thought I'd share it just because I think it'll provide some context, especially for the two protagonists and the possible antagonist, possible anti-hero. Depends really on where the story goes. That's mentioned in the synopsis. But in order to do that, we got to travel back to the time of 1526. It's the birth of the Habsburg dynasty. Now, I'm not a historian, guys, so if I get dates wrong, if I mispronounce names, please tell me in the description below. I'm incredibly sorry, but I'm not. I'm not entirely familiar with this period. I researched it entirely for the sake of the album. So. With that being said, the Habsburg dynasty is established when Ferdinand I is crowned king of the Czech Republic. Now, prior to this, several, maybe even 100 or 200 years ago, before that, the Catholics and the Protestants had been at war after John Huss, which was one of the Protestant ministers, was burned at the stake for denouncing the Catholic faith in a few sermons that he did, which led to a war. So Ferdinand, his first order when he had come into power was to reestablish the Catholic faith as the dominant religion in the Czech Republic. Now, Ferdinand invited a group of men called the Jesuits into Prague at that time. And the Jesuits, for those that don't know, were Catholic scholars and missionaries from that time. But let's fast forward to 1576. So after Ferdinand died about 12 years after, his grandson Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor, was crowned king of the Czech Republic. And this is really where the story starts to get interesting, guys. So Rudolf was crowned king 12 years after the passing of his father Ferdinand. And at this time, like, even though he was crowned king, and had the title of Holy Roman Emperor, he really didn't care much for his duties at all. He was Catholic, but he didn't care about the Protestants or the Catholics, who of course were on the brink of a second war after the first one had ended a few years ago, and his grandfather Ferdinand had stripped the rights of everybody. But what he was obsessed with was art and magic, more specifically arcana. He believed there was scientific basis for it, and it consumed most of his time. Now, we've got a mad alchemist king who cares nothing of his deprived people who are on the brink of war. Tell me that doesn't speak Blind Guardian. Rudolf's brother Matthias had his eye on the kingdom, and that's really where his goals were specifically. He'd convinced his brother to let him deal with Protestant rebels up in Hungary. And he came up with some sort of agreement, declaring that they'd have religious freedoms in their land, that sort of thing. But a year later from that, supposedly, his brother fell ill. And it's at that time that Matthias had declared himself the head of the house and future Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Rudolf was stripped of everything except for his title, which was really hollow at that point because it had no power or anything. He was just literally called the Holy Roman Emperor, and his brother was dealing with everything. So, unsurprisingly, he passed away 9 months later. So, when Matthias came into power, as we mentioned before, the Protestants and the Catholics were on the brink of war already after the establishment of the Habsburg dynasty. And the reason for that mainly being that they felt that lots of their rights had been taken away since the Catholic faith had been prominently asserted as the main religion through that land. But Matthias's goal was to remove the last of those rights. So in the year of 1620, like something straight out of a movie, he threw a bunch of his governors out of a window, literally into a pile of garbage. Now, if that's not a twist and myth, I don't know what is. But what this did was prompt what's perhaps the most Blind Guardian sounding war of all time, the Battle of White Mountain. So the Battle of White Mountain took place between the Habsburgs and the Protestants, And it was a complete bloodbath, mainly for the Protestants, who were completely slaughtered and decimated by their forces. It did three things other than start the 30-Year War, which is the backdrop, of course, for the synopsis of Legacy of the Darklands and the Darklands novel. The first thing it did was nearly erase the Czech language, which is why this is the Dark Age in the Czech's history. It caused a lot of their materials and food to be scarce because they had killed off all the farmers who were running the farmsteads. And lastly, it decimated the population greatly. Now, after this was done, Matthias had banned all faiths other than the Catholic religion. And this, my friends, is where the backdrop of the novel truly begins. And now, dear Noldar, without further ado, we reach the synopsis of the Darklands. This takes place 9 years into the 30-Year War, during the Czech Republic Dark Ages. Now, I've taken the synopsis and translated it through Google Translator. So if there's any discrepancies or any kind of interesting things you see, those of you that speak German, let us know down in the comments below. A mercenary, dark forces and magic. 1629, the 30-Year War with its conflicts shakes Europe and rages particularly mercilessly in Germany. The young adventurer, Annalyn Kane, travels to the neutral city of Hamburg to explore the legacy of her famous father, Solomon Kane. So for the bards who don't know who Solomon Kane is, Solomon Kane was a fictional character developed by Ron E. Howard, who was a pulp writer in the 20s or 30s. And he's the same author of Conan, which was another one of his characters, which he wrote many stories for. Solomon Kane was a Puritan. And a Puritan was a Protestant who objected to the Catholic faith, and generally they wandered the lands as kind of the traditional pilgrim that you used to see with the those hats. In the paintings and stuff like that. There's actually a movie of it, but I don't think it's very accurate to the stories in particular. But Solomon used to wander the lands. He was a sort of demon hunter, or a vanquisher of evil. He'd search out things like vampires and anything from vampires to evil spirits. Together with her friend Tamina, a Persian mystic, she gets into the turmoil of war. They take on a momentous mission of the West India Company. A ragtag team is to penetrate through the lines to southern Germany, as far as Bamberg, where cruel witch trials burn the stake. But many things are different, too much for a coincidence. So if you had a chance to read the article issued by Blabbermouth in March at the release of the Darklands, the German version, on March 1st, it says that the two protagonists have actively been cultivated their creative exchange over the last 5 years, and it's referring to the exchange between Blind Guardian and Marcus. And if you aren't aware of the West India Company, don't fret. Don't go back to the history portion. I didn't cover it. Really, all you need to know is that they're Dutch merchants and foreign investors who held a large monopoly in the West Indies at the time. Annalyn and Tamina know about the evil and the demons that romp the earth, and use the turmoil of war to their advantage. Soon it'll be more than an order from the company, and the leader of the troops, Nicholas, has a dark secret. So I don't know about you, but when I read that last paragraph, my mind was kind of set at ease. Initially, I had kind of concerns, given that the Orchestral album is such a Blind Guardian thing. And to think of anybody collaborating on it that isn't Hansi, it kind of worried me a bit. Now, Hansi's never steered us wrong before with his lyrics, so he's a proven thing. And he has taken inspiration from different novels, whether it be Tolkien or, The Wheel of Time or, any number of different opuses that he used as inspiration, let alone periods in history. But when you look at what Marcus has laid out, collaborating with Blind Guardian, we have war-torn Europe, a famously bloody war, and we have two protagonists who are scouring that land demon hunting protagonists in search of evil, one of whom is a Puritan. Or at least a descendant of a famous Puritan, which means that she's an enemy of one of those sides. And aside from just the evils of man, we have the forces of darkness to worry about. The synopsis talks about demons manipulating the situation, manipulating the tides of war, even. So I think that provides a really interesting angle. Both are female protagonists, which is another interesting choice, because during that time, given the witch trials, they're in danger of that as well, which is mentioned. But both have what could be considered a form of magic in some way. If Annalyn, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that again, if Annalyn comes in contact with the relics of her grandfather, one of which is the Staff of Solomon. And Staff of Solomon is tied in with the Rod of Moses, which he used to part the Red Sea and work his wonders. Now, Tamina is a mystic seer from Persia. So when you think of it in that way, she's exotic and she has the power to tell the future, which is one of the things that lots of people were burned at the stake for less. Which I think provides a really interesting backdrop. Now, if some of you are saying, well, that doesn't really tie in with anything Blind Guardian, I want to point you back to Night at the Opera. Now, we spoke earlier in the video about, and then there was silence. Musically almost telling us and hinting towards the orchestral album in some way. And Under Ice as well as another one I want to point to, both of which are about Cassandra, who was a famous mystic seer during the Trojan War, who was taken as concubine and subsequently killed. But because of that, like, who does this sound like? We have a mystic seer, in the heat of a bloody war. I don't know. I'm seeing some parallels between Tamina and her. But aside from that, guys, I think we should really just be excited about this prospect. This has been something that's been building. We've seen throughout the video. This has been building since the 90s. And if anything is true about Blind Guardian, we look at, after Imaginations from the Other Side taking 4 to 5 years to come up with an album, and each one is genius. Each one, almost tops the last. I mean, it doesn't, don't get me wrong, like, everyone's going to have their favorites, and not everyone's going to like it, but nothing that's been released by the band has really fallen short of expectations, at least by some of the fans, if not all. Now, with Annalyn following in her grandfather's footsteps, we also have the whole war between the divine and evil, a reoccurring theme in Blind Guardian music. Look at most anything. I mean, War of Wrath, Into the Storm, in the Silmarillion about Melkor and his forces of darkness. Like, there's a lot of that tied into much of Blind Guardian, the Fallen One. There's a lot of different connections in that point as well. But I think that it all really leads towards something that's going to be a huge, really exciting album by Blind Guardian. And I don't think that the novel or the lyrics in any way are going to be limiting what they've been working on for decades. The next thing I want to talk about is the character of Nicholas. Now, Nicholas is mentioned in that Blabbermouth article by Hansi as a complex character that's perfect for our works. And he describes him as mysterious, which I think is the perfect name for him, because I've spent the last few days translating more German articles than I care to admit, trying to find out any shred of information on it. And even though the book's been out since March, there's very little information on it short of a short expert. We know that he's a mercenary captain during this time, and that he's going to play a prominent role, whether as an evil character or an anti-hero or whatever it is, in the legacy of the Darklands itself. The mercenaries around Captain Nicholas, who, according to Tamina, is surrounded by a very strange aura, have themselves received this commission in a most unusual way, and with a certain Moritz Miller, a true giant with very thick skin, who has recently joined them, the inventive little jacket,
and the extremely war-troubled Statius. The colorful dressed warriors form a very colorful bunch. So that being said, dear friends, I think we should do a recap here and talk about why this album is important to us, like the original intent of the video, and also why those of us that know why it is, hopefully a few of us have developed a bit more appreciation for the amount of time and work that's gone into it. One, after Imaginations from the Other Side, every 4 years they started releasing albums, 4 to 5 years, and they all turned out fantastic. Some might have a few that they don't like, but you can't argue that at least the quality of it is high, or at least I hope you can. The other thing is that Marcus Heights is the perfect person. I mean, Marcus Heights is already a famous fantasy writer. And he's won several awards, but that's not what's important. What's important is that his work ties in personally with Blind Guardian, and what's more than that, by his own admission, he was a Blind Guardian fan before they even approached him. And lastly, given the context of the story, I think it fits perfectly with what the orchestral album should be, even though it might not have been what everyone was expecting. And this has been pushed back a lot, but it is on the edge of the horizon, guys. I know a lot of people have doubts because it's already June. Pre-orders haven't started, at least at the time of this video, which is released on June 30th. Pre-orders have already started, or haven't started yet, and it's released in November. But even if it does get pushed back, guys, and we end up waiting a couple more months, hold on to it, because I think if anything we should take away from this, that it's going to be well worth the wait. And this, my friends, ends the first chapter of Podcast from a Twilight World. If you liked what you saw, hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to check us out over on Facebook. What do you guys think is going to be the reworked song for the upcoming album? Do you think it's going to be part of the album itself, or do you think it's going to be a bonus track? I would love to hear from you. And of course, if you've got an idea for an upcoming podcast, feel free to comment down below. As I said before, the next two have kind of been already planned out. But after that, I'd love to get a few of you guys on to talk about your love for the greatest band ever. So with that, let's leave it to the memories and kiss the wind goodbye.